All right. Oh, hi everyone. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I have a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Pennsylvania. I focused on mapping out some of the neurobiological structures that underlie addiction and anxiety, and experienced a healthy dose of anxiety myself in the process. Anyways, a paper came out just about 3 days ago that touches on a topic that's come up many times over the years, microdosing. So it's one of those topics that's like reliably come up over the years, like ever since I started talking about the brain on the internet. And every time a paper would come out on the topic, I'd plan on getting into it on a podcast, spending like a good amount of time exploring all the nooks and crannies of the topic. But something always came up, and I wouldn't be able to get into the depth that I thought the topic deserved. And I still can't quite get into the depth that I'd like yet. Because I'd love to do a whole sort of like biography of that topic, because there's a ton to talk about. Not a ton of great research, but there's a lot to discuss. But anyway, so this paper came out just a few days ago that explored some of the purported benefits of microdosing. So I figured, it's worth just exploring this paper at a minimum, and maybe, we can get into the greater depth on the topic at some point in the future. So I imagine quite a few people, perhaps most people, would be wondering what on earth I'm even describing by the term microdosing. At its simplest, it's exactly what it sounds like. Ingesting a psychoactive substance, but at minuscule doses relative to how they're typically used. So technically, this concept could apply to any kind of substance, right? But it's really only used in reference to a certain class of drugs, psychedelics. So to be specific, I'm talking about subhallucinogenic doses of these psychedelics, which include substances like LSD and psilocybin, which is psilocybin is like basically the active ingredient of magic mushrooms. So it's been discussed for years at this point, but it's sort of exploded in popularity back around 2015 in Silicon Valley. So for anybody who's unfamiliar with Silicon Valley, it's like basically the tech capital of the United States, where companies like Apple, Google, Facebook, Intel, companies like that, it's where they're based. So it's pretty much like the broader area around San Francisco. And so there's a whole interesting story of the possible role that this family of psychedelics played in one of the sort of like initial generations of these companies, and in that area of California in general. But suffice it to say that the use of psychedelics was pretty much endemic at that point in that area. So just to get a little bit into this history, there's a quote from a mathematician named Tim Scully in an article from The Economist in 2018. And so Scully worked with a chemist named Nick Sand to produce a gigantic amount of LSD in the 60s. After getting out of prison, having been there for about 10 years, he worked at a computer company. I don't really know exactly what that means, but he was working at a computer company. But he was quoted as saying, quote, "Working in tech, it was more of a plus than a minus that I worked with LSD. People in technology, a lot of them, understood that psychedelics are an extremely good way of teaching you how to think outside the box," end quote. So, the notion that these substances might be more than just fun, but useful, was sort of floating around, not only in, the area around San Francisco or Silicon Valley, but, within the tech industry specifically. Like, probably the most famous example of that culture was Steve Jobs, one of the founders and presidents and CEO of Apple. And so he would speak about his experiences. So evidently in the biography of Steve Jobs that Walter Isaacson wrote, he implied that Microsoft would be more interesting if Bill Gates had indulged it, which is, kind of cute. Anyways, so there's much more to this history, including the psychologist who probably originated the concept of microdosing, who evidently participated in the experiments in Menlo Park. But I feel like, now's the time to exercise some discipline, and let's just get to the point. So there have been publications that explore whether this family of drugs might be useful for some more like practical or clinically relevant applications. So the study I want to talk about today was published in a journal called the Journal of Psychopharmacology, which, by the way, is edited by a scientist named David Nutt in the United Kingdom. And anyone who already knew what microdosing meant before I gave my super short description either already knows who he is or really ought to, because he's easily one of the most influential neuropsychopharmacologists in the world at this point. So if you're interested in microdosing and sort of the broader biology that sort of domain of work, it's worth checking out his work. So this paper was published on the 8th of this month. in October. So I guess maybe it was accepted then. I'm not sure, but it came out in October, and it's a pretty simple paper. To be honest, it's really just a survey, but it's like a very, very big survey when it comes to substances like these. I think it's worth noting that it's pretty difficult to study these substances, and it's particularly difficult to study them in like the numbers of people, the sample sizes that would be necessary to get a sense of whether microdosing might be worth exploring. So, it's of course very obvious when a full-blown dose of psychedelics begin to take effect, right? Some of the most obvious signs are, the walls beginning to oscillate and, a person begins seeing like geometric patterns on the ceiling and stuff like that. But when it comes to getting a sense of the effects that fractions of those doses have, it can be, super subtle. So that's the point. The goal of microdosing is to pursue super subtle effects, right? But generally speaking, microdosing involves fairly regular use, something like once or twice a week. Not always, this isn't like a thoroughly standardized procedure, but that's the sort of thing that we're talking about here, the frequency that we're talking about. If you're trying to detect whether minuscule doses of substance with effects that are normally characterized by like very overt alterations of consciousness, getting a sense of the effects of the long-term use of these substances at these fractions of typical doses can be pretty difficult and would require like a large number of people, right, for any kind of confidence. So not only that, but given that these substances tend to be about as illegal as substances can be, certainly in the United States, arranging a study that's just like designed properly to assess these effects is essentially illegal at the moment in the United States, but not only the United States. So here we have the next best thing. It's a survey-based assessment, and it's certainly not the best, but it's something, and I find it interesting. So here's a paper. So the group had a few goals. First, they wanted to assess prior findings regarding the perceived benefits and challenges that resulted from microdosing with LSD or psilocybin. So then they wanted to see if people who engage in microdosing test the substances that they obtain to ensure they're taking what they think they are. So like a purity test kind of thing. So the survey for this study included just over 120,000 participants in 215 countries or territories, but only just under like 5,000 participants had microdosed with LSD in the past year, and just under 3,000 had done so with psilocybin. So interestingly, about 850 participants reported doing so with both, which is kind of an odd strategy, but that's what they reported. And finally, I think that this is the more interesting thing that they did. They wanted to explore whether like the initial goals that people had for exploring microdosing, if those initial goals had like an effect on their perceived benefit from doing so. So like, in other words, would you experience positive results from using these substances, microdosing with these substances, if you anticipated positive results, and only if you anticipated positive results? Or could someone who had no idea what the potential effects of these kinds of drugs could be have a completely different reaction, potentially negative reaction, just because they were starting out with different expectations? That's like one possibility. So just to review and summarize like their goals a little bit more coherently. So here are their hypotheses. So they hypothesized, and I'm quoting from the paper. First, the three most common benefits of microdosing will be improve mood, improve focus, and increase creativity. Second, so that's the first hypothesis. Second hypothesis, the three most common challenges of microdosing will be concerns about illegality, physiological discomfort, and impaired focus. And then the third hypothesis is that the majority of participants who microdose will not have tested the substance that they've been using to microdose. So they can't be 100% confident that what they think is LSD is actually LSD. And then fourth, their final hypothesis was that participants who report an approach intention will report significantly more benefits than participants who report an avoidance intention. So that's their fourth hypothesis, and by that, what they mean is that people who are trying to like approach improvements in cognitive or psychological states will report better results than people who are trying to avoid negative states, right? So that's approach intention is the first, avoidance intention is the second, and they think that approach intention will be associated with greater benefits. So before we get into their finding, let's talk a little bit about who participated in this study. So first, they were working with something called the Global Drug Survey, what they call the GDS. which is evidently the world's largest online drug survey that's been maintained since 2012. So it's based out of London, and it's collected in like a ton of different languages, from like English and German to Hungarian to Romanian, Serbian, Turkish, 19 languages in total, and it's hosted in the survey is hosted in 20 different countries at the moment. So the samples, or the sample, which means like the collection of people who are included in this study, are self-nominating. So that's how they describe it, which they correctly describe as being what's called a non-probability sample. So non-probability sampling just is like a technical term that just means that the sample of people in this study don't represent the broader population of humans. But they're recognizing this while conducting this study, so they deserve some credit for that, right? What they're basically saying is that like they're collecting data from people who simply decide to volunteer their answers, right? So they're like nominating themselves to participate in the study rather than being like sought out by the scientists. So there are many things that would distinguish a person who's never been interested in or exposed to, or if they'd done either, would be horrified at the notion that other people would know that they had done that. That kind of person will be pretty distinct from a kind of person who has been exposed, would be fine with people knowing, and so on, right? So people who both partake in the use of psychedelics and are willing to talk about it are likely different in a few ways from people who've never been exposed to them at all, right? So this GDS, Global Drug Survey, it's a really cool website. I haven't explored it as much as I'm hoping to, and I hadn't heard about it before. Or I guess maybe I'd heard about it, but I never really informed sort of my PhD. So for example, they have an entry on global drug use in the context of COVID-19 that ran from May to June over the course of 7 weeks. So I just skimmed the executive's summary, and it's super interesting. It looks like they collect info on everything from CBD to MDMA, basically like pretty much any drug you could think of. And they seem to offer their survey services to people who are interested in collecting information related to drug consumption. It's pretty cool. It's a pretty cool effort, and you can explore some of their findings if you like at globaldrugsurvey, just one word, .com. So, okay, back to the study. They were focused on two psychedelics in particular, as I said earlier, LSD and psilocybin. And so the group anticipated that the most commonly reported benefits of microdosing, again, would be improved mood, focus, and creativity. And so it turned out that the participants in the study did tend to report two of the three, so excluding focus. And it turned out that improved focus was less commonly reported than expected. And when it came to the challenges, the negative experiences that were encountered by people who were, again, self-reporting as engaging in microdosing, they ended up not detecting one of the things that they'd anticipated: illegality. So, in fact, the most commonly reported challenge was none. And so, in this study, that they reported. The way that they interpret this is that they report this as being, a promising finding. And, if this were truly a representative finding, that would definitely be a promising finding, but, that would, of course, speak more about the kind of legal landscape in which participants are operating. Like, for me, what that finding indicates is that the people who are responding to this survey were one of two things. They either didn't really worry about what might happen if they were discovered to possess LSD or psilocybin, which at least in the United States, again, are as illegal as a drug can be, or they knew that they were in a socioeconomic position that reduced the likelihood that it would be a problem for them. It would just be essentially negligible if it was discovered. By law enforcement. And so, this brings up a whole different conversation about like the inequities of how drug laws are enforced. But, suffice it to say that, at least for me, this finding is that a surprisingly low percentage of microdosers is likely more descriptive of the sample of people who participated rather than, the concerns that might emerge from, microdosing itself. So, a fair counter-argument would be that, this whole concern emerges from criminal law that like, need not or should not, in my opinion, exist. In other words, if these substances weren't classified as Schedule 1 in the United States or Class A in the UK and equivalently, like, turbo illegal in many other countries, would this concern and therefore, the source of any negative experiences even exist? So, to be fair, the authors explore this topic in greater detail than I'm describing, delving into like legal consequences versus social stigma, right? Those are two, pretty different things, stuff like that. Obviously they're related, but distinct sort of concerns, but still, the reality that a concern over illegality was reported surprisingly infrequently, is meaningful, but not necessarily in a way that, specifically characterizes microdosing. So other challenges that people reported included physiological discomfort and impaired focus. But then there was also impaired energy, meaning like restlessness or fatigue, and then cognitive interference, meaning like mental confusion and memory difficulties, racing thoughts, things like that. So I think the limitations of this study are all like really very important to consider. First of all, anyone who even knows what microdosing means is going to be in a pretty small group of people. It's a group of people who like avidly explore this topic, the pharmacology and the rationale for trying microdosing. It's also, a group of people who, even know where to get LSD and psilocybin, right? So we're talking about like a very unique sample of the population. There's no way that people who participated in this survey can be, interpreted as representing the broader population when it comes to, their expectations or their effects, which, we acknowledged in the beginning, they sort of acknowledged too. But, they never make the claim that this study represents how everyone's gonna respond to microdosing with these substances. So, basically like the central message of their paper is that microdosing with these compounds warrants more investigation. Some people definitely seem, to report that they had positive experiences, positive reactions, and so it's worthy of greater investigation. When it came to the approach versus avoidance intention hypothesis, they collected, some interesting data. So it turned out that the survey participants who indicated that they began microdosing to avoid negatively appraised states, meaning like they were experiencing negative emotional states in general, prior to microdosing, and they thought that microdosing might help them to avoid those negative states. They tended to report greater benefits than those who were doing just fine, but wanted to experience improved cognition or psychological states. Right, and so this is the opposite of their hypothesis, and they do a good job of recognizing that the survey may have failed to detect some benefits or implicitly negative effects of the participants' experiences, and they also of course recognize the whole concept that the expectations for a given experience with these types of substances can dramatically influence the effects that these substances produce. But it's an interesting finding that people who are engaging in microdosing, because they thought they were feeling bad, right, and thought that doing so would yield improvements, that they experienced the greatest benefits, relative to people who were just interested in trying to improve like an already pretty good baseline. And so, given the whole concept of set and setting, they expected that those kinds of initial expectations and conditions would have a substantial influence on the outcomes. So, it turned out that the intention of avoiding negative cognitive emotional states responded the best to microdosing, at least according to the respondents of this survey. And when it came to anxiety, the group didn't find a relationship between microdosing and a change in reported levels. So, to be clear, that doesn't mean that like microdosing wouldn't increase levels of anxiety, nor that it would decrease them. It just shows that the people who happen to participate in this survey, who once again are representative of a pretty unique population, they didn't end up reporting changes in levels of anxiety. So probably the most frustrating limitation of this study, as like sincerely interesting as this global survey and this study and this topic is to me, is that we don't have any standardization of doses that were used by people who were microdosing. This isn't like a criticism of the researchers, it's just like important to acknowledge that as an important limitation in how we can interpret the findings of this study. When it comes to a substance like LSD, doses can be basically impossible to identify in most cases due to just like how it's typically like supplied and dispensed. And there's a similar challenge when it comes to psilocybin, most commonly consumed via the various mushrooms that produce the compound, given that there's like a ton of different kinds of mushrooms that produce psilocybin and similar psychoactive compounds. And the levels present in any given sample of a single mushroom can vary according to how it's grown or stored or prepared, and so on. It can be pretty difficult to come to like a consistent dose that any large group of people might be consuming if they're relying on mushrooms for their psilocybin, or they have no ability to understand or detect the doses of LSD, like on blotter paper or in a liquid. So when it comes to understanding the sample that participated in this study, like another concern that comes to mind is that if people have enough LSD or psilocybin to microdose, were they engaging in full-blown psychedelic experiences every now and then, right? Particularly if they, more often than not, weren't really concerned about the illegality, right? I just have to wonder if some of the participants, and if only some of them did, then that's a similar problem. If some of the participants were taking larger doses of the substances periodically, if that's the case, then we're not really talking about the effects of microdosing alone anymore. There's plenty of research that explores the sort of, extended effects of single higher dose experiences with these substances. And so, I appreciate that they acknowledged the fact that there will be pharmacogenetic differences. This is like an interesting point that isn't necessarily appreciated by a lot of members of the community, or the sort of recreational drug using community. And by pharmacogenetic, what I mean is that, like, given that we all have different parents who have different parents and their parents had different parents, right, and so on, we all inherited a unique set of genes as a result. And so the responses that we'll have to these substances can vary quite a bit. Some of us have relatives who have been diagnosed with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or depression, and so on. And so, some of us don't. And, there's plenty of research suggesting that people can tend to respond to these substances pretty differently if they have a family history of these various psychiatric conditions. And so another limitation of a study like this, and more importantly of the prospects of microdosing, is the infrequency of purity testing. So, like, in other words, like, most people did not test the substance that they were microdosing to ensure that it was indeed what they thought it was, LSD or psilocybin. And, this is a substantial limitation to this study. Not that there's anything that the authors could have done about it, but, given the massive diversity of substances that have subjective effects that are sort of similar to LSD or psilocybin at the doses that induce, like, hallucinations, it may be the case that some of the survey respondents were microdosing with totally different substances. Even when it comes to LSD, which is, again, extremely potent, there are substances that are similarly potent and capable of inducing similar subjective effects at those higher doses that induce, psychedelic hallucinations, but they have different chemical structures and therefore they have different pharmacologies, like the, dimethoxyamphetamines. In some cases, substances can be really quite dangerous at high doses, and the effects of long-term administration of low doses is basically impossible to anticipate, like whether or not it's benign or potentially, harmful just in a different way than those high doses. So, while these substances can have, like, similar subjective effects at high doses, the differences in their pharmacologies can result in, like, pretty different consequences over, like, an extended period of time, theoretically, right? And so what they report is that the participants in this study said that they were taking about 10% of the doses that they'd take to experience, like, the more sort of typical full-blown psychedelic dose. So, I'm certainly not recommending that as, like, as like a dosing strategy. They aren't either. It just happened to be, like, the most common kind of reported strategy. So that's another issue, is that, like, some people might have been microdosing with 10% of the dose of LSD, some maybe, 25%. That's, like, a pretty substantial difference in dose of LSD. And then also it's like, how frequently were they doing it, right? Was it twice a week? Was it once a week? Was it once every 4 weeks? So, it's sort of frustrating, and it's of course there's nothing, again, that the scientists could do about that, but we just have to incorporate that in our interpretation. So where does that leave us? First of all, this study produces very, very limited indications of what the potential utility of microdosing might be. So, for all the limitations of the study that I described, and I probably spent more time on the limitations than I did on the findings, but what we really need to see, if we're going to treat the prospect of using very low doses of these substances as, like, a serious therapeutic or performance enhancement strategy, is we need a randomized placebo-controlled trial, of course, right? The gold standard of the kind of experiment we conduct when we want to see if a given substance, treatment, therapeutic has a beneficial effect. And, so, like, that's basically, like, the highest standard of experimental scrutiny. But then again, if we're talking about these substances that so profoundly alter states of consciousness, and substances that are, frankly, like so understudied, I think that's really the standard we ought to apply. If we're going to explore the prospect of like regularly ingesting them for any reason. And one other thing, this is coming from like a jaded PhD in neuroscience. This paper struck me as being a publication that these authors, who are clearly familiar with this sort of neuropharmacology, it strikes me as a paper they were able to generate in this era, where there are many labs are operating at fractions of their capacities because of COVID-19. And I know that's certainly the case in a lot of labs with which I'm familiar. So I have to imagine these scientists decided just to get a bit creative, get resourceful, and pursue this topic using the tools that were available to them. And so they came to some interesting findings, right? Not the conclusive findings that I suspect many people might hope for, and certainly what people should demand if they're going to entertain the notion of engaging in microdosing. Okay, so that's what I have for you today. Sort of a simple study, but it's the first study about microdosing that I've seen for a long time. So there you go, microdosing. All right. Well, why don't we start the live half? Hello, everyone. My name is Ian McLaughlin. Oh wait, I did remember this time. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I have a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Pennsylvania. And on YouTube, I just talked about a topic that's come up, pretty frequently over the years: microdosing. So microdosing refers to the kind of sort of consistent, it kind of varies a bit, ingestion of psychoactive substances, most frequently substances like LSD or psilocybin, in pursuit of either improved, cognitive states, improved emotional states, or avoiding negative emotional states and cognitive states, and also pursuing creativity. So I talked about that on YouTube, youtube.com/anthropoid. Let's see, what's going on here? Okay. And so, yeah, microdosing, youtube.com/anthropoid. I hope you all have been staying reasonably safe and sane in this insane period of time through which we're living. So the paper I talked about came out earlier this month, and it was basically using essentially like a survey platform that has been maintained since 2012. And it's in many different languages. It's all across the world. And so it came to some interesting findings. All right. Why does the brain taste like iron? Well, I have a question for you. How do you know how brains taste? I know some people, do ingest animal brains. And I couldn't tell you exactly what it would taste like. Cow brain. Okay. I would be surprised if that were the case. But probably what that would mean is that not enough or not a lot of the blood that perfuses the brain has been removed. So you're probably just tasting blood. Kind of a weird opening topic. Hey, what's up, Scott? We were just talking about what brains taste like. And by the way, I would, if you're entertaining the notion that you might eat brain at some point, I would discourage you from doing that. Probably the smartest Alzheimer's researcher I've ever had the privilege of meeting and working with for very short periods of time. I got scammed then, thanks. Well, no, it could. It's just, the blood just hasn't been removed from that brain. But the brain tissue itself probably doesn't taste like iron. I would imagine it tastes sort of like a gelatinous, kind of like egg-like kind of flavor. That's what I would guess, and it would probably vary based off of how it's prepared. I would imagine it could be gritty if it's cooked in certain ways. Anyways, yeah. So I would discourage anybody from eating brain, just because of the possibility that the prion hypothesis of Alzheimer's disease is correct. Prions are sort of like, many of you might have done that sort of like at home science experiment where you can, precipitate, you can grow salt crystals out of salt water, right? If you just like have a saturated solution, it's just some water, you put a ton of salt in it, and you just let it, and maybe you put a string in it, and then you like let it kind of sit for a while. As the water evaporates, it'll leave behind that salt, because the salt's not evaporating, and that salt will crystallize and sort of grow along that thread or whatever, string. And so the whole concept of the prion hypothesis of Alzheimer's disease is that it might be the case that these sort of initial kind of seed crystals of the aggregates of Alzheimer's disease, amyloid beta plaques and neurofibrillary tangles, may kick off a sort of domino effect of the aggregation and sort of like, causing Alzheimer's disease when it wouldn't have been there. And there's evidence that these prions, that there is evidence for that. There's evidence like if you introduce amyloid beta plaques into the brain of an organism that didn't have any, it can begin to generate accumulation of amyloid beta plaques. And so it is possible that, if you eat brain, you may be exposing your own biology to these prions, which may or may not, probably not, but maybe might kick off an accumulation of those aggregates. So I wouldn't recommend it. Awesome. Yeah. Gritty, like the Philadelphia. Is it? Yeah, it is gritty, isn't it? Huh, that's funny. Yeah. How do you prevent those plaques? That's a great question. Well, first of all, there's no surefire way that we can prevent the accumulation of the two aggregates that are sort of like the signature of Alzheimer's disease. Again, that's amyloid beta plaques, neurofibrillary tangles. What they are basically, they result from two different kinds of proteins being sort of improperly processed that then kick off their own accumulation, sort of like how lint would gather in your pocket, that kind of thing. And so there have been some attempts to either prevent the further accumulation of these amyloid beta plaques, or to prevent that from happening in the first place. And one of the most creative and I guess marginally effective, unfortunately not therapeutic, not clinically successful, but was the use of basically vaccines, sort of training the immune system to recognize amyloid beta plaques and neurofibrillary tangles, and then having the immune system essentially attack, destroy, and remove. That's been basically like the main strategy that's been attempted several times over the years. Like it was attempted, I think, in like 1999 maybe, or many years ago. And it's been attempted several times ever since then. And there was a clinical trial that was conducted, I think last year, that and so the problem with this strategy is that people tended to have pretty adverse reactions. Not everybody, but some people. And even when it was found that people who had amyloid beta plaques, who administered these treatments, were evaluated following treatment, and there was a reduction in the sort of global, the amyloid beta plaque load, meaning just like how much there is. There weren't clinical improvements, so like their cognition didn't improve, and that kind of thing. So I think there was a small molecule therapeutic that was attempted not too long ago, like a couple months ago, and it wasn't this sort of immune system strategy, it was something different, that I think was an improvement on the sort of standard of care. I can't remember how that therapeutic worked, though. I sort of saw that in passing. But basically the short answer is that we don't really have any way to prevent that accumulation from occurring. But that whole study where they did indeed show evidence that amyloid beta plaques had been reduced, but there were no improvements in cognition, sort of made some of the field wonder, is the amyloid beta hypothesis of Alzheimer's disease correct, right? Are we correct that it is because of the accumulation of these plaques and tangles that people develop Alzheimer's disease? Maybe it's just a sort of another byproduct of something else that's happening that both causes the dementia as well as the amyloid beta plaque accumulation. So yeah, but my personal perspective is that we needn't question that whole concept quite yet. But yeah, that was a sort of like, that study made some waves. Even after being fried and dissolved in the stomach. Yes. Yeah. So you're talking about prions. That's right. Yeah. It's pretty crazy, right? So prions are not organisms, right? They're not like living things. They're not viruses, for example, or they're not, although a lot of people would suggest that viruses are not living things, but they're sort of like just barely biological, right? They're just like a shape of a protein. That's it. That doesn't, doesn't use any energy, doesn't reproduce sexually. It just sort of like, it's very similar to crystal formation, whereas you just have a structure that then arranges in a specific conformation that then produces something like quartz, right, or a diamond, right? But in this case, it's a rather more tragic accumulation. All right, how do you prevent those flags? Right? Can you make Can your brain make your penis longer? Well, sort of. I mean, sort of, right? If you become aroused, that your brain is definitely involved in that. So, touche, my friend. I know you were trying to troll, but can't get me. All right. So you're saying we need to train and arm killer T cells to fight Alzheimer's disease. Well, sort of. So it wasn't T cells necessarily. It was like I think it was microglia in the brain. You're just sort of like an immune system adjacent kind of type of cell that inhabits the brain. So yeah, but it is similar. It is like manipulating the immune system to take out the trash, essentially. All right. Let's see. Why is it difficult to study adult neurogenesis? Wow. So Grace, that's a great topic. So for anybody that's not familiar, first of all, neurogenesis means the genesis of new neurons. The emergence of new differentiated cells that turn into neurons. Generally speaking, there is very little neurogenesis that occurs in the adult brain, but there are some sites in which it does occur. So, for example, like I have a 1.5+ daughter who is experiencing tons of neurogenesis at the moment, way more than I am, but in certain regions of my brain, like the dentate gyrus of the hippocampus is this big seahorse-shaped structure. It's not. It actually is not shaped like a seahorse, but that it's a very large structure that participates in like memory and mood and in spatial navigation and all these types of things, and so it has a bunch of substructures. One of the substructures is called the dentate gyrus, and there's a certain kind of neuron that undergoes neurogenesis there. There are other parts of the brain too, like parts of the striatum that undergo neurogenesis. The main difficulty is it's difficult to find people who allow you to take biopsies of their brain, if you know what I mean. And so, it's tough to get like primary cell, culture, from somebody who wants to stick around. So yeah, that would be like the primary difficulty. But also it's not a very common occurrence in the adult brain. So, there's only a couple places where it happens. So, those are just some of the difficulties. Another, like, to make this a little bit more concrete, like, we have fMRI that can help us to understand, how much metabolism is going on in different parts of the brain that then is, correlated with, levels of activity in those parts of the brain. But those are just sort of general global, or not global, but like large anatomical regions rather than like circuits of neurons. And then we have like electrophysiology where we can measure the activity of specific neurons. But there's this whole area in between where it's very difficult to get a real-time readout of whole circuits of neurons that are communicating with one another at any given moment. And that is really like the sort of the most productive or the most informative domain of neurobiology, if you're interested in understanding human behavior, psychology, consciousness, and so on. And so and we don't really have like a technology that enables us to image like specific neurons within specific regions of the brain in a living human. So until we have that, it's just going to continue to be really difficult. What are your thoughts on how what we digest calcifies the pineal gland and how that affects us? It's really interesting how like calcification of the pineal gland has to be one of those topics that's like so esoteric, but also like so widely so widely discussed. So what we're talking about here is the pineal gland. First of all, is a very small part of the brain, basically just on top of the thalamus, towards the middle sort of kind of core of the brain, very close to a part of the brain that I studied for my PhD called the medial lobennula. In fact, back in the day, in ye olden anatomy days, the structure I studied was thought to potentially be the sort of stalk of the pineal gland, and they sort of evolved over time to separate. But it's probably not the case, but they are pretty structurally similar, and the part of the brain that I studied receives and sends information to and from the pineal gland. So anyways, pineal gland is a pretty simple structure relative to like the hippocampus or something because it's so small. It's a very evolutionarily ancient structure, which generally means that they can be a little bit strange relative to, like, they're unique and kind of strange relative to like the cortex, for example. And they also can be sort of very dense. And so in any case, I could go on and on about the pineal gland. I'm happy to if you'd like. Hey, Kleinykins, good to see you. But it, like other parts of the brain, over long periods of time undergo a process called calcification, which basically just means the accumulation of a form of calcium that is hard. And that's kind of strange. Why would that happen? But if you think about why that would happen, it kind of makes sense. Calcium in its ion form is a critical component of neuronal signaling. In fact, without calcium, it would be very difficult for neurons to release neurotransmitters. Essentially, every time a neuron, not every time, but a lot of the time, the majority of the time that neurons are firing impulses, they are experiencing changes in levels of calcium. And so, you have these building blocks of what could generate calcification. Now, the problem with calcification, sometimes, and so this happens naturally. Like, this is not, you don't have to be exposed to, like, alien like devices or anything like that for it to happen. It happens naturally as we age, but in some cases it can happen much more rapidly than in other cases. And the problem with that is if a structure is calcifying, it loses some of its functionality. Fortunately, like the pineal gland, it's like an important brain region. All regions of the brain are important. They're all equally important and special. But it's not like critical. It's not like if you lost your pineal gland, your life would be like kind of weird. Your like sleep schedule would be completely wonky. There have been studies that explore what happens when you lesion an organism's pineal gland. And basically, one of the like most overt changes is that the circadian rhythm of those organisms just begins to drift. So rather than like getting tired at, whatever, like 7 p.m. every night, like you'll get tired at 7 p.m. one night, and then 8 p.m. and then 9 p.m., and then on you would go, and it would just sort of like drift. It's like this very sort of kind of beautiful data set. But like beyond that, like you would still be able to breathe, you'd still be able to think, you'd still, a lot of the things that you hold near and dear to your consciousness would be essentially unadulterated. I mean, so I wouldn't worry too much about it. And also, like if you have, if you're suffering from any psychiatric condition, right, and you suspect that it is calcification of the pineal gland that is responsible, you're probably barking up the wrong tree. We can talk more about that if you like. Oh, look. It looks like we have a caller. Oh, the volume might be messed up. Let's see. Oh, no, looks like we're good. Javier from the UK. What's on your mind?
I had two questions on my mind this week.
Awesome.
I read a quote online saying that the majority of IQ is determined by genetics. Is that a true statement?
Well, it's a fraught topic. So, like, if we're just being, as simplistic as possible, there are plenty of data that indicate that, yes, genetics is extremely predictive of IQ. However, and what I mean by, like, for many years, that has been sort of dogma in intelligence research and then in some neuroscientific research. But more recently, what I would consider to be better science, more elegant, more comprehensive science has been done that indicates that, yes, of course, nature plays a very significant role, genetics plays a very significant role, but when you begin to control for all of the various factors that we, social primates, all the factors that influence us and can sculpt intelligence, can determine, like things like access to resources, educational enrichment, environmental enrichment, trauma, exposure to all these types of things. If you control for all of that, then the sort of dominance of genetics over IQ begins to subside a bit. And, I think sort of like at the moment, the kind of standard, the least controversial, or no, I would say the most widely held, common wisdom at this point is that intelligence is a byproduct of both. And for sure, genetics plays a very significant role, but it's not as, it's not like the singular determining factor of intelligence as it had been described for so many years.
Yeah. The other question was about hormones being released or produced in the brain. Say, for example, when someone begins puberty, they may go, the first 11 to 13 years of their life without that cascade of hormones, firing the way they do at that particular time. And I was wondering, of any, because I'm guessing, it's kind of like I don't know if it's like one day, that's the day that puberty began for that person, or if it's like a gradual development up to that stage. I'm just wondering what triggers within the brain for that, humongous difference for puberty to begin. What is it? Like, I understand that the hormones are released on a day, but what's causing the hormones to be released, And then what's causing that? Is it turtles all the way down? Or,
So I haven't seen any evidence that it is turtles all the way down when it comes to the onset of puberty. That's a great reference, though. So frankly, I would have to review that. The onset of puberty is just, it was so far from, my research that I'm failing to remember. But here's what it probably is. And you can correct me when you actually find the correct answer next week. A lot of human biology is regulated by, essentially like biological clocks, right, that are genetically regulated. So, for example, your circadian rhythm is regulated that way. There are like literally genes that have been named, things like clock, that, essentially like they begin being expressed, in a cycle, right, where, they get expressed a little bit during the beginning of the day as, there's more and more light being exposed to the eyes, and, the protein byproducts begin to accumulate. And then the accumulation of those proteins begins to influence the expression of another gene that then begins to, express a different protein, right? And then which inhibits the expression of the first one, and then it begins to accumulate, and then the same sort of feedback loop happens. Obviously, that's on a very, very small time scale, but I would imagine that there is, some set of genes that is subject to, the expression of some protein at a certain point in life that begins to induce, the secretion of testosterone or estrogen from, these, reproductive organs. That's what I would imagine, but I cannot tell you the actual pathway. I'm sorry to say, Javier.
Yeah, that's all right. I guess more research I'm going to have to do on this.
Yeah, maybe you can teach me next week.
Thanks a lot.
Oh, thanks for calling, man. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Javier, always bringing up like really interesting topics. If a person has, this is on YouTube, if a person has well-developed long-term sustained alcohol addiction with years of physical, mental deterioration, can they ever be free from addiction in the future, or will it always be about management? Wow, that's a excellent question. This is from Frank on YouTube, youtube.com/anthropoid, where I talked earlier about microdosing. Okay, so basically this is like a contentiously debated topic within addiction science, and it basically comes down to, is it once an addict always an addict, or or another sort of similar type of question is, are people born addicts, right? Are people born with the susceptibility to developing addiction given the right circumstances, right? And those circumstances can be like you were born with, a certain gene that, a certain variant of a gene that expresses a certain kind, certain version of a receptor. And so the moment those receptors are exposed to nicotine or opioids or whatever, boom, like you've pulled the trigger and, off to the races we go with addiction. And there are definitely people who argue not only is that not the case, not only is nobody born an addict, but saying that people are is counterproductive. Because you sort of put people in a position where they have no hope for recovery. I mean, what's the point of even trying if I'm always going to be addicted to the substance? I sort of those debates are for different kinds of scientists than I am. They're important and valuable and everything, but I just don't think that they're the most interesting. In my mind, somebody who has developed alcohol addiction or addiction to any drug, I think we have enough evidence at this point that some people inherit the genes that render them more susceptible than other people to developing addictions. But certain environmental criteria have to be met as well. So, for example, like a huge proportion of people who develop an addiction to any substance experience some childhood traumatic event, and it can vary quite widely. What kinds of events those can be. It can be abuse. It can be neglect. It can be chronic stress. These types of things, right? So those types of things are just as important, if not more important, more determining than you happen to have inherited a sort of neurobiological landscape that makes it so that when you are exposed to oxycodone or heroin or whatever, you experience tremendous euphoria, relief of anxiety, these types of things, whereas other people don't. And so those other people you could consider them to be protected against addiction, while other people, people who are susceptible, are not protected against it, right? So like that's just like an important thing to, I think, recognize, is that like there are these biological predispositions that we've inherited. I know I've inherited them for sure, just judging by how I react to opioids. So there's that. Another thing that I think is worth appreciating is that the biology of addiction, it is a longer lasting biology than just the acute effect of the drug and the acute withdrawal phase, and even the prolonged withdrawal phase. So alcohol is a good example. I think it's maybe a little bit, well, no, let's just use alcohol. So one of the primary things that disincentivizes quitting is the withdrawal that people experience after they've been using alcohol or any drug, any recreationally used drug, for an extended period of time, right? And for alcohol, the withdrawal can be really quite severe. In fact, it can be life-threatening if somebody has been consuming really massive amounts of alcohol. So that's an important feature of whether or not somebody can recover from addiction, is just being able to make it through that period. And then there is what some people would call the post-acute withdrawal syndrome. So basically, like the cravings. So you've made it through withdrawal, and then you experience cravings. Certain environmental factors can trigger craving like months after you've stopped drinking or stopped using opioids. And so that is like a whole sort of phase of recovery. And what evidence is coming out that indicates that I'm most familiar with the opioid research, that exposure to let's say recreational doses of opioids can induce epigenetic changes that will last for at least quite a long time, right? And so so the biology is sustained for quite a while, right? But when you say, can they ever be free from addiction in the future? The answer to that is yes. It doesn't matter what the biology is doing. I mean, it matters to understand what's going on so we can help, improve treatments for alcoholism, addiction in general. But from the perspective of somebody who is, trying to do that work, addiction is very difficult to treat, right? It is one of the hardest psychiatric conditions to treat. And we don't really have ideal resources, but people recover, and it's not completely impossible, right? It's not unheard of, right? People recover from addiction. We do have some resources available to people who are trying to quit, and so what I wouldn't concern myself too much with whether or not I just have the biology of an addict. I should just resign myself to not being able to control this thing. Rather, I think you should look to the fact that people when they, engage, when they consult with these resources, people can recover. And, they may relapse or whatever, but, by and large, right, recovery is a real thing. So that's what I would focus on, despite, the fact that the biology is still complicated. We still have a lot to learn, but that it can, be sustained for a while. All right, I see Deanna Hooper's in here. Lovely to see you once again. Deanna Hooper's a cosmologist living in Europe. I can't remember where you are now. Are you in Belgium? No, Germany. Are you still in Germany? Anyways, she's a scientist. She's a cosmologist, studies like dark matter and the cosmos. So check her out. Brussels. Oh, sweet. So that was right. Yeah. That old noggin isn't failing me too much these days, or at least it's not failing me entirely. So DC Hooper 91. Check her out. Off-topic question. What are the physiological effects of grief on the brain? Yeah, well, it's certainly not off-topic. I mean, grief, it's like there is an interesting body of literature that explores it. Like the psychology of grief, the sort of evolutionary benefit of grief. But, it can become an issue when there's like rumination or perseverative thoughts, when somebody is unable to escape just this thought loop of contemplating whatever the cause of grief, and so if that's the case, it's similar to depression, and there are there are definitely biological consequences of untreated depression that extend above and beyond just the sort of the troubling symptoms, right? The impact on quality of life. So it could be disrupted sleep patterns, appetite, lethargy, lack of motivation, a sort of social isolation, and so for me, I know that if I had lost somebody to COVID-19, for example, I would definitely, seek out some treatment. I don't know what the culture is like in that part of the world, in Europe in general, but in the United States, I think there is this hesitation to get work with a therapist. It's this weird stigma against it, and I would definitely consider that, because the biological consequences are the consequences, but for sure, it's worth getting some professional guidance. Okay. I mean, just to give you an example of like some of the biological consequences of depression, right? There are studies that show, reduced, gray matter volume, meaning like anatomical volume of structures like the hippocampus in folks who have, been diagnosed with depression for a long period of time. And so, it's things like that follow from untreated, protracted depression or grief. I was hoping you were talking about microdosing for depression and anxiety and how people start this. Yeah, so I did on YouTube, youtube.com/anthropoid, Don. The short story is that there was this, basically, here's what really happened. There was this group of scientists, where were they? I think they were in, I think it was distributed. I think some were in the UK and some were in Germany, and I think like the Netherlands, but in any case, they were stuck at home in their away from their labs because of COVID-19. And so there is this really interesting, very insightful and sort of exciting enterprise called the Global Drug Survey that's been maintained since 2012 that is offered in like 19 languages, I think. Hundreds of thousands of people have participated over the course of its existence. And this group basically queried whether a large enough number of people, or how many people they could find, that microdose. Microdosing, for anybody that's not familiar, is the consumption of like minuscule fractions of the dose of, generally speaking, psychedelic drugs, LSD, psilocybin, for just the thing that Don brought up, for at least for some people, to help to mitigate the severity of depression or anxiety, mood-related psychiatric maladies, and but then some people take it, engage in microdosing to amplify performance, essentially, to increase creativity, to increase, cognitive acuity. It's probably the most common in a part of the United States called Silicon Valley, which is sort of like the San Francisco area. And psychedelic drugs have been sort of endemic in that part of the world for many years now. So predating like Steve Jobs, who was sort of like very public about his the utility he saw in LSD. But anyway, so they essentially their finding was that, and there's a lot of problems with the study, or not, just a lot of limitations for the study. But it is interesting, and basically, like, one of the things that they found was, and one of their hypotheses was that, those two motivations for taking microdosing, the avoidance of negative psychiatric states versus the approach of, again, things like increased creativity, increased energy, improved memory. Those are two different intentions. One is avoiding, trying to avoid things, and one is trying to approach things, trying to approach improved creativity rather than trying to avoid depression and negative mood-related experience. One of their findings was it turned out that the people who were avoiding those things, those negative psychiatric states, tended to report greater benefits than those who were approaching other things, approaching creativity and so on. A lot of limitations with the study, though. Check it out if you're interested in greater depth. YouTube.com/anthropoid. All right. Have you done studies on meditation and its effects on the brain scans, and activity? There's a ton of studies into meditation at this point. Not a ton of really high quality research. And when you hear that, you're probably like, who are you to say like low quality? And like, what are these high quality scientists versus low quality scientists? No. There is, high quality science and low quality science, but that's determined by essentially the strength of the experimental design and the confidence that we can have in interpreting the results as a result, right? So like, how many people were involved in the study? Is the sample of people involved in the study representative of the broader population? Or are you only studying like, college students who live in the Cambridge area, right? That's representative of a population, but it's not representative of the broader population. But there have been some solid studies. Anyways, there's been research into trying to characterize the patterns of brain activity that are unique to states of meditation in people who are like, expert meditators, right? And take it from me, I like took a class in mindfulness meditation, and it's very difficult to like actually do it and not just be sitting there saying like, I am meditating. I mean, I guess you could do that. You could just like repeat that mantra, but there is like a unique cognitive experience that occurs when you're at least engaging in mindfulness meditation. And so, there's been research that identifies certain patterns of brain activity that are unique to those states. And so, yeah, I mean, there have been studies that show that mindfulness meditation, that's the form of meditation with which I'm the most familiar. I also think it's the most useful form of meditation that I highly recommend to other people. In fact, for the first time in years, I meditated at the office. So I have, my little office, I was just exhausted because I have to get up super early when I actually do in-person work at the State House, and so I have to wake up, super early for me. It's like 5:30, and so I was just exhausted, and I was half like, I wish I could just take a nap sitting up. I wish I was one of those people, but I cannot. And so I just sort of sat there, and then I was like, hey, while I'm here, why not try doing what I used to do, mindfulness meditation? And it was so good. And I did it for a long period of time, probably longer than my supervisors would be thrilled to hear. But I did it for probably like 25 minutes, 30 minutes. Again, keep in mind, I was exhausted, and then after that, I was just able to summon the motivation to actually do the work that I needed to get done, or at least I wanted to get done. Which, by the way, should expand access to naloxone for the residents of New Jersey. So I highly recommend it. But, there have been studies that identify changes in human biology following, certain like periods, certain like durations of, meticulously adhered to schedules of mindfulness meditation. Things like reduced glucocorticoid levels, reduced cortisol levels. Cortisol is a hormone that's broadly speaking associated with states of stress, states of environmental challenge, perceived or otherwise. And so, levels of cortisol increase, generally speaking, when, you're just chronically stressed out. And it was shown that mindfulness meditation, and the people who did it, for weeks, I can't remember the duration of time, but it was like, 12 weeks or something like that, tended to have lower levels of circulating cortisol. So there's that. There have been studies that, like, there have been studies in people who have been diagnosed with an anxiety-associated condition. This was a study done at Johns Hopkins. I don't know why that always sticks out to me, but it does. That found that people who were diagnosed with anxiety-associated conditions, who were, instructed mindfulness meditation, at the end of their study tended to report greater benefits than people who were not diagnosed with any psychiatric condition who did the same thing. So could potentially indicate that mindfulness meditation may present some benefits, some therapeutic benefits to people who are suffering from, certain psychiatric conditions. It would not be the first line treatment for these conditions, but it may help. And I should, acknowledge that, like, mindfulness meditation for people with who are prone to anxiety can be very anxiogenic. Like, I remember when I was taking my class, there was, somebody just broke out crying, and he was like this guy, who did not, you wouldn't expect him to cry in public. Let's just put it that way. And he was like straight up crying. And it was sort of like, jarring a little bit, because for me it was just like so peaceful and so pleasant. I looked forward to that class every week, and I think it was twice a week. So it's not just like, it's not as simple as it seems. But anyways, yeah, there's definitely research. How do you feel about electric shock therapy for helping people with bipolar disorder, PTSD, and depression? Yeah, I mean, that's a great it's a great question. So I think what most people think of when they hear convulsive therapy or electroshock therapy is like scenes from, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest? Is that what it is? Where they're just zapping someone's brain, and just electrocuting them, essentially. And it used to be that way, but no longer. So at this point, it is definitely not a frontline treatment for any psychiatric condition. But for people with treatment-resistant psychiatric conditions like depression, like severe depression, for whom no medication has worked, maybe have even tried some of the more novel, innovative, or as I like to say, innovative treatments for depression, like ketamine or like transcranial magnetic stimulation, or potentially coming up, psilocybin. Then this treatment is an option. And how do I think? I mean, I think I'm glad that somebody stumbled on it. I think that people perceive it as almost like torture. And it's not pleasant, but it has been shown to relieve symptoms of depression for a long enough period of time that it's worthy of consideration for somebody who's suffering from severe depression. After all, severe depression is a life-threatening condition. So yeah, I mean, it's certainly not as precise as I would prefer. The treatments that I hope my research may yield will be far more precise. It'll be a scalpel versus like a hammer. But hey, I'm grateful to be living in an era where we have more than just one option at our disposal. Okay, golden teachers. So Jojo is talking about a specific kind of psychedelic mushroom. You know what I always found fascinating? I always had a misunderstanding. I always thought that there were psilocybin producing truffles, like underground growing fungi, and maybe I just don't even know what a truffle is. But they're actually not like truffles. They're just like this sort of, it's almost like a sarcoma of mycelium. So yeah, that's kind of interesting. I suffer from logorrhea. I don't know what that is. Sorry. Yes, I've been microdosing with shrooms in good intentions, and it's helping. Interesting. So Sean, or is it Sean? Yeah, or Shauna, maybe, of Barsoom. Shauna of Barsoom. Yeah. So I just talked about microdosing on YouTube. YouTube.com/anthropoid. The easiest word in the English language to spell, I know, anthropoid. But anyways, yeah, and again, I talked about all the limitations of this study, but they did come to here's like where it left me. Like, I wish that there were placebo-controlled, randomized placebo-controlled trials of microdosing, because the pharmacologies of these drugs are so interesting, but then also unique relative to basically any other category of medication that's used to treat psychiatric conditions. And so, maybe they're not actually beneficial, but I think it's worth evaluating that. And I should say, people who were using them to avoid negative psychiatric, like, not even psychiatric, like formally diagnosed conditions, but like avoiding anxiety or avoiding depression, tended to report greater benefits than people who were using it, which I think is probably the more common iteration. At least it has been in like Silicon Valley, the use of microdosing to boost creativity, probably most intensely popularized by a guy named Tim Ferriss, who's sort of like a sage kind of in Silicon Valley. But it's been around, it predates him. And something funny that I discovered when I was reading into microdosing a while ago was probably like the guy who probably invented microdosing participated in the experiments at Menlo Park. Pretty wild. All right. Hey, I'd like to know about the neuroscience updates about fibromyalgia. Do you know about it? So, sure. I mean, updates about fibromyalgia. Do you know about it? Yes, I'm familiar with fibromyalgia. It is one of these conditions that sort of fairly recently has been kind of more widely embraced by the medical community. But it is also a condition that is really difficult to understand. And there's many reasons for why, but here's one reason for why. Fibromyalgia can manifest in different severities, in different ways. Generally speaking, it involves pain of some kind. But it can be associated with, or some cases of fibromyalgia respond to psychiatric interventions rather than exclusively like anti-inflammatory treatments, or like immune modulators or things like that. So Shauna says, I had a nurse tell me fibromyalgia isn't real. Yeah, so I mean, I'm sure there's plenty of physicians who still are of that opinion. I've heard one, call it a sort of kitchen sink diagnosis, basically meaning like, we don't know what this like patient population is suffering from, and there's some differences among them, but we'll just call it all fibromyalgia. And that's fair enough. Like, in science we do try and base as much of our, or I should say medicine tries to base as much of their conclusions on science as possible. What's my opinion? So yeah, here's what I think about it. And I should say there's not a ton of research into fibromyalgia. But my thought is that fibromyalgia is what we call fibromyalgia is probably a couple different conditions that emerge from. It can be a sort of chronic inflammatory, disease where, for whatever reason, it could be exposure to an allergen of some sort that you don't really know you're allergic to, but you're chronically exposed to it. It can be something like, being exposed to some kind of, pathogen of some sort that then triggers this sustained immune system activation that then sort of causes widespread inflammatory processes that can be, will be registered as painful. That can be one thing. Like, let's call it a more sort of biochemical, immunological explanation. But another can be that, it's pretty uncontroversial to suggest at this point that there's a pretty significant relationship. Mind states influence body states. So, we know that for, people who were traumatized as children, they can experience like psychosomatic pain that is not based in, an injury of some sort or an infection of some sort, but rather based in the, a person's consciousness sort of projecting this pain that is very real. Like it can of course be debilitating, but trying to target it through immune system modulation or whatever, treating like a parasite infection or something like that, rather than those things just would not be effective, because that is not the etiology of this cohort of people, right, who are suffering for a psychiatric reason, right? And so those two things can manifest in very similar ways. They can look very similar to an outside observer, and they can be experienced very similarly, but they're pretty different biological mechanisms, and so therefore, they should probably be called different things, right? But at the moment, we just do not have the granularity of information to distinguish these different patient populations. Since you're a brain scientist, what do you think of DMT and everybody's spiritual experience on it? Do you think it's in the mind? Well, it is. I mean, hey, Leonora, good to see you. Psychosomatic pain, like when I think of my ex and it makes my chest hurt. Yeah, kind of. Yeah. That's a trauma of a sort. The spiritual experiences that people have, not just on DMT, essentially on most psychedelic hallucinogens, is absolutely based in the brain, right? I think what you're asking is there something else to the experience? Is there something else that underlies this experience? Is there some metaphysical explanation for this experience? Because it sure feels that way, right? That is sort of like an intuition that a lot of people come to. And as, a lot of neurophilosophers will argue, like, we should not underestimate the value of that intuition, right? That if something feels so true, then it should be recognized as one piece of evidence. That personally is not how I see consciousness and neurobiology, but that is an argument that can be made. So first of all, we know a lot about we know a lot about the sort of mechanistic pharmacology of psychedelic drugs, DMT included. So DMT is structurally very, very similar to psilocybin. Psilocybin is basically just a slight modification to a DMT molecule for phosphoryl dimethyltryptamine versus just dimethyltryptamine, which is DMT. And they both have pretty similar effects. Obviously, there's differences, and those differences would be based in pharmacology, but they're far more similar to one another than, let's say, DMT is to cocaine, right? Or alcohol. Those are pharmacologically rather different. And we know that essentially any structure that is able to interact with the structures with which DMT interacts will induce this sort of somewhere in this category of effects. So we're talking about psychedelics, right? So, visuospatial kind of alterations, hallucinations, like the walls moving a little bit, just like alterations of incoming sensory information, right? They all do that. They can do it in slightly different ways. They all have slightly different auxiliary effects, let's call it. But the reason that they all do this is because they all interact with the same system. The serotonergic system, and specifically the 5-HT2A receptor. We know if I were to synthesize a molecule that specific and never been invented in the world before, and I made it so that it could interact with the 5-HT2A receptor and this serotonin signaling system in general, but mostly the 5-HT2A receptor, I could predict for you what the effects will be. If I designed it to bind the 5-HT2C receptor, you wouldn't probably consider it a psychedelic drug, right? And so when you ask, like, are these spiritual, these transcendent, these numinous experiences that people experience on psychedelics, are they based in the brain? Absolutely. And I think that there's enough evidence for us to conclude that it's exclusively based in the brain. But everything, the most important experiences in your entire life, your first kiss, the love for your parents, the love for your spouse or your significant other, the love for your child, right? All of those things, the most, critical, defining experiences that we have are also all based in the brain. And so to suggest that just because this the experiences that people have on DMT, to suggest that just because the experiences are based in the brain, that renders them mundane or less important, less numinous, less transcendent, I think is just misunderstanding the nature of human consciousness. And so, I think it's just as important. That doesn't detract any of the realizations or the profundity of the realizations that somebody has on these substances at all. It doesn't detract it from it at all. It doesn't make it less magical. In fact, I think it makes it far more magical that from all of these inanimate molecules arises human consciousness. First of all, I think it's amazing. But then second of all, that you can sculpt the experience, the subjective quality of consciousness by just one molecule, right? Well, a lot of the molecule, but just one kind of molecule, I think is amazing. That to me is far more transcendent, far more beautiful than you're communing with machine elves, right? Like, how is that magical? Okay. Okay. You're full of anger. I am not full of anger. Thank you. I am a little angry. I will cop to that. I am a little angry at how thoroughly this country has failed to respond to COVID-19. I will probably be angry about that for the rest of my life because I think it has inevitably affected the development of my 1.5-year-old daughter. She will never be this age again, and she will never be able to make up for lost time socializing with other babies, with other adults, going to the museum, going to the science museum, the art museum. I will never forgive these people for that, and I will always be angry about it. I'm also angry that we in this country haven't done anything, really anything, to respond to the opioid overdose fatality epidemic in this country. Between March of 2019 and March of 2020, more people have died from a drug overdose than ever in the history of this country, ever. Right? That was just a couple months ago. That year. Higher than the former record, which was set in 2017, just over 70,000. We're probably looking at over 75,000 people that will be lost to drug overdoses this year. Maybe far more because of COVID-19. So yeah, definitely I have some sources of anger. I do my best to dampen those by surrounding myself with the people I love and interacting with my brilliant little baby daughter, and trying to emphasize all the things for which I am extremely fortunate. But yeah, if you're detecting a little bit of anger, you're not wrong. Okay, if you ingest a chemical, it has the potential to chemically affect your brain. It's nothing magic. Yeah, right. That's right. Like, that part of it isn't magic. I mean, I think there is something magical about human consciousness. It's wild. Like, it's wild that these, again, inanimate atoms arranged in just the right way produces, Starry Night, produces the art of Monet, produces, you know what I learned about? Okay, what's it called? It's called, Stendhal syndrome. Okay, so you might have heard of Jerusalem syndrome. Jerusalem syndrome is very funny. It's basically people to whom Jerusalem is a very, very important part of the world, part of human history for obvious reasons. This is a formally recognized psychiatric illness. People go to Jerusalem for the first time, and they've been wanting to go forever and ever and ever, and it has such cosmic importance to them for understandable reasons. They will evidently, about 50 people a year do this. They'll begin thinking that they are Jesus Christ. They will begin thinking that they are the Messiah, and they'll like dress up in the garb that they assume Jesus would have worn. So that's called Jerusalem syndrome. And they're like, I think I remember reading that one of the interventions was making it so that in the hotel rooms. Another important component of Jerusalem syndrome was they become despondent that Jerusalem isn't what they expected, that it's sort of like remarkably a normal place, like a normal city, and so they can become that's sort of a part of the kind of delusions that can then emerge. But then a wilder one that I learned about is Stendhal syndrome, where people will go to Florence. Florence is a very, very beautiful city. I've been wanting to go to Florence for so long at this point. I have had the chance to visit other parts of Italy, but Florence was like my number one. So people will go to Florence and they will essentially have a breakdown, like a psychotic episode, racing heart, sweating and paranoia and all of the whole deal, right? The whole 9 yards. And it's associated with being exposed to so much incredibly beautiful art in one place at one time that people just break down, and they not everybody thinks that that's a real thing. What's another one? Another one that I learned about, which is very funny, is listomania. Listomania if anybody can tell me what listomania is, I will be very impressed, and I will definitely give 50 points to Gryffindor, because it's so funny, and it's like, well, I'll give somebody else a chance to see if they know it. Okay. Sorry everybody, I kind of went on. Hey, what's up, Abitz? Good to see you, man. Yeah, the gang's all here, almost. That's an interesting, reminds me of the depression people had when they watched Avatar in 3D. You know, I wondered about that. So what he's talking about is, they're like, after the release of Avatar, you know, the movie with the aliens, and you know, you have an avatar. It's kind of easy to I'm sure you know what it is. People became depressed, evidently, because they couldn't live in, what is it called, Pandora, I think, the world of the Avatar, of the aliens. I kind of wonder if that wasn't a little bit of marketing. I might be wrong, but I kind of wonder if it wasn't like, just like, man, that movie must be really good. It's sort of like the kind of macabre, like, feature of opioid addiction, which is like when people hear that a bunch of people are dying from a given sample of opioids, which happens here in Philly all the time because of increased presence of fentanyl in samples of heroin. Fentanyl is far more potent. Fentanyl is probably like the most important cause of fatalities in this country. I mean, apart from COVID-19, obviously, but prior to COVID-19. Why you ignored my question? I didn't mean to. So yeah, it's sort of like, wow, if it's so good that people are getting depressed by how much they wish they could live in that movie, I better go see it. I wonder. Is it the melancholic song from Hungary that causes people to commit suicide? No, so close though, close. Okay. So I'll just tell you, Listomania. It's named after Liszt, the conductor. I guess it's Lizst. I think is how you pronounce it or spell his name. Composer, I should say. And you know, like in the time, I guess I can't remember in what era he was popular. Liszt. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, Francis. Thanks, man. At the time, there wasn't like the kind of like celebrity that musicians experience these days, where people just lose their minds. Like I don't know if you've ever seen videos of how people reacted to the Beatles, but like, whoa. And like, you know, Justin Bieber back in the day, or I don't really know who the new ones are, but people lose their minds. And evidently, like, that hadn't really ever happened before. Evidently, Liszt would have the same kind of reactions, would evoke these kinds of reactions from people. They would just go crazy. It was like this whole mania. And people were like, wow, this is probably like a psychiatric condition. It just kind of struck me as funny because, you know, we certainly don't pathologize that these days. Okay. William John, I can see your comment. Is consciousness independent of the brain? Ooh, I bet Javier has some thoughts about that. Is consciousness independent of the brain? So that is a debate that is ongoing in neuroscience. But if you could picture this debate as a tug of war, where one side is arguing that consciousness is, like, the brain produces consciousness. There's no other substrate for consciousness. It comes from the brain. And the other side is arguing, no, there's something else to it. It's irreducible. You cannot reduce consciousness. You cannot explain consciousness by the physical stuff of the brain. See that tug of war? That side used to be working, or used to be winning. They used to, and it is a philosophy called dualism, or a framework called dualism, which suggests that you know, consciousness emerges from more than just the brain. In some cases, you know, there are arguments that, you know, the brain is very important to consciousness, but it's not like the end all be all. There's something else. It's, yeah. So, and then, but so that used to be like the dominant explanation for consciousness. Certainly, well, and I guess, but these days, I think it's safe to say that the monoist, or the people who argue against dualism, the people like me who argue that consciousness is something the brain produces, and the brain alone, essentially, the nervous system, and it doesn't reside anywhere else other than the brain. And I just think that there have been enough, there's been enough evidence that's accumulated over the years that makes it pretty clear that, that makes it very difficult to argue even like a soft dualist perspective, or like a compatibilist perspective, where, you know, that there's some other source of consciousness. just the vast majority of evidence would support that that's just not the case. I mean, we can go like probably the most direct source of evidence for like dualism not being an adequate explanation is that, if you damage any one part of the brain, if you were to remove my pinky, I would be very upset with you. I would probably want to pursue some kind of recourse, legal or otherwise, but I would still be me. The same old goofball that right? My consciousness would not change. A very small sliver of it would, but it wouldn't fundamentally be altered in a very profound way. However, if you were to remove a pinky-sized slice of my brain, my consciousness almost certainly will be dramatically affected. Depending on the source from which that pinky-sized sliver of brain was removed. There is just this one-to-one, essentially, relationship between the biology of the brain and consciousness. Okay. And by the way, like essentially the people who are still kind of holding out, the philosophers who are still holding out for dualism, basically, I've never seen an argument that didn't have a lot to do with free will, didn't have a lot to do with like debating whether or not free will exists. I think that the person who does this the best is named Patricia Churchland, and she essentially is arguing for something called free won't, right? Which is like she's saying, don't even worry about free will, whether or not it exists, libertarian free will. What we should really be concern ourselves with is self-control, because we have that. We at least experience that. For me, I think it's sort of like a convenient way to reframe the debate, such that, you're just redefining free will, or you're just ignoring the question altogether. And, you're essentially saying that what the brain is doing when we decide to not do a thing, to not eat a pint of ice cream, to not punch somebody in the face, that is exercising free will. For me, I think that is just it's not even wrong. Like it's like you're just not appreciating enough, I think, the relationship between biology and human behavior and consciousness. So, I mean, there's nothing different about the emergence of an urge to engage in a behavior and the decision to inhibit engaging in that behavior. There's like nothing fundamentally different about that biology. Okay, very interesting. Two close relatives, one has gone to prison, other is going to prison soon, sentencing. Both have addictions for decades, 20 plus years. Both have been clean at times. Thanks for deep answer. Yeah, sorry to hear it, Frank. Yeah, I mean, addiction, I think, is like one of those features of society that really warrants more sophisticated and devoted attention, because I think it is a solvable problem, and I think part of what's holding us back is that we have these like really philosophical perspectives on drug use, on what drugs are okay, what drugs are bad, and that have nothing to do with biology, with public health, with neuroscience, certainly. And so, but they at the moment basically set the foundation for how we talk about drugs in this country, and in much of the world, not just the United States. Oh, cool. Whoops. Boom. Got it. Looks like we are connected to Scott. What's on your mind, man?
Hi, Ian. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. How about you?
Seems always everyone.
Yeah.
Hard time now. I apologize. I think I asked you this a year or two ago, and I kind of forgot. You were talking about the DMT and the pineal gland earlier. Are you able to separate fact and fiction with the recent popularity that's probably from, I'm going to blame Joe Rogan for that, saying, the pineal gland secretes DMT while you sleep, and that's why you can take this and then experience dreams while you're awake. And I thought you told me that was kind of not true.
Yeah, it's definitely not true. So, well, I mean, there's certainly no evidence to suggest that it is true. And, when it comes to neuroscience, we don't just, embrace a hypothesis in the absence of any evidence, or in science in general, not just neuroscience. I imagine cosmology operates kind of similarly. Yeah, so that is based on, and you're right, Joe Rogan is probably like the prime popularizer of that whole myth. But it originates in a book called The Spirit Molecule that was written by a guy named Rick Strassman, a PhD named Rick Strassman. I think it might be an MD. I think he's a PhD. Called The Spirit Molecule, and basically he hypothesized that not only is DMT produced in the brain, dimethyltryptamine produced in the brain, but it is also the thing that enables us to have dreams, and that is released when we have near-death experiences. It was just speculation. I don't think he ever portrayed it as anything other than speculation. But it has just been the pineal. So the pineal gland is cool. Like, it is anatomically very interesting. It's, as I said earlier, it is simple, but like phylogenetically, it's very interesting, evolutionarily, because it does sort of have the structure that resembles what could have potentially become an eyeball. So, what's that? Sorry.
You mentioned it in reptiles. The pineal gland has an eyelid. I don't know if that was part of the also untrue part, or if that is real. Sorry.
Yeah. No, so that is true. So, we're basically doing something called comparative anatomy. But what is likely the equivalent of their pineal gland, right? We're evolutionarily pretty far removed from reptiles, but it is true that there is a structure sort of in the general anatomical location of where our pineal gland would be if we didn't have a neocortex, which is towards the top of the brain. And the pineal gland in humans does receive information from the eyes. It does receive, and it's specifically the presence of light, specifically blue light, blue wavelength light. Not a lot of brain regions get that information. It's also organized anatomically in a kind of strange way. But anyways, in these reptiles, it seems to be the case that their equivalent of their pineal gland did mutate over time to become more like an eye than certainly ours did. And it serves probably a very similar function. It's not actually generating any visual experience, so they're not actually seeing up. But what they're probably doing is just detecting the presence of light. And then that influences a bunch of their biological mechanisms, appetite, whatever. So that's true, and that's interesting. I mean, that's very cool. And comparative. What's that?
Sorry. So that's probably where the mythology of the third eye came from, and because it's kind of resembles an eye, and that probably was dissected to reptiles that they first. I'm guessing the people thousands of years ago didn't dissect humans, but. You think that would have been why that's called that?
I don't know. I think maybe they did do that in like Egypt, didn't they? But I mean, I don't know. I think that that whole like third eye thing may not have emerged from Rick Strassman. I imagine it predates a lot of it. I imagine it predates us even knowing that DMT was a molecule, right? But yes, I mean, certainly these days, like that is one of the sort of factoids that sort of sustains this myth. But so here's why. There's no reason to believe that that's true. Let's focus on two things. First, there's no evidence to suggest that DMT ever reaches meaningful concentrations in the brain, ever, right? There is evidence that it exists at what are called trace levels, so extremely low concentrations, like essentially negligible, right? Not at concentrations that we would expect for a molecule that's playing an important role in regulating, our conscious experience. So there's that. So second of all, they're like the things that people use DMT to explain, things like, again, dreaming, near-death experiences, things like that. Those can be explained without needing a exogenous or even an endogenous psychedelic molecule. Those can be explained by circuits of neurons communicating with other circuits of neurons, regulating things like or changes in their activity over time when when they're not getting as much oxygen, or when you're asleep, the fact that you're not tethered, not anchored by your sensory system, you still have this brain activity. It's occurring, and we know a lot about what's happening when people are dreaming, including lucid dreaming. And so, why it is that, and also like the nature of the experience of DMT is so different from like, I think what I usually hear when it comes to near-death experiences or, when people are dreaming. Like, it is a pretty specific sensory distortion that like just it doesn't. I don't understand why like people who have had experiences with this molecule would say, that must explain it, because like psychedelic hallucinogens are like nothing. Like they're very different from dreams, right? There are drugs that one could suggest maybe that I think would be more convincing, like a deliriant hallucinogen, like datura or diphenhydramine. But you know, so I just think it doesn't make sense pretty much at any level, but certainly it doesn't make sense at the level of evidence. So yeah, okay, that's my spiel.
Thanks for clearing that up.
Yeah, my pleasure, man.
It's kind of a little bit depressing next year to tell me that we use more than 10% of our brains.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, I wouldn't do that to you, Scott. I like you too much. All right, man. Thanks for calling in.
Thank you.
Whoops. First time seeing on Periscope. Interesting topic. Awesome. Well, welcome. I appreciate you joining us. What's up, chaps? What did I miss? Hey, Aiden. Never heard of that. So interesting. What creates free will other than consciousness is what I would wonder, never having done any research. Listen, like when it comes to free will, I'm biased, but I think neuroscience is the most adequately equipped discipline to scrutinize whether we have free will, and if we do, from what it emerges. But you know, to sum up, this is on YouTube, youtube.com/anthropoid. You can watch this there too. And I also talked about microdosing earlier on today. Microdosing specifically with psilocybin and LSD. The short story is I don't think that. I think most people, their concept of free will is something called libertarian free will. You know, that no decision, no experience, no behavior is encumbered by any like restrictive force, any determining factor that exists anywhere outside of your brain. So I think that's generally speaking, like I think people don't necessarily agree on what free will even means. A lot of definitely philosophers don't. But you know, I think broadly speaking, libertarian free will is probably what most people think of. And you know, just what I understand about the brain, my own research, where I was able to essentially determine the direction that an organism was walking by just modifying activity in very specific neurons. It's evidence like that, this one-to-one change. You know, let's pick that. So you might say that's like motor movement. That's not a particularly romantic part of free will. You know, what about you know, what determines whether or not you experience something like déjà vu? Well, believe it or not, if you were to be extraordinarily reckless and sit down in front of me and allow me to remove this part of your skull and allow me to stimulate that part of your brain, the exposed part of your brain, the medial temporal lobe, you would experience déjà vu, and you wouldn't stop experiencing déjà vu until I stopped stimulating. You know, it's just like evidence like that is just, I think, so it so effectively demonstrates that the brain regulates consciousness, the brain regulates behavior, or the brain, I should say, it produces those things, and so, you know, it is perhaps an inevitable byproduct of the way we evolved that we have the sensation that we are generating all of these behaviors. You know, in other words, there's probably no other way to devise a human consciousness if someone truly didn't feel like their behaviors, their experiences, their thoughts weren't just bubbling up in the moment. They sort of feel like that, right? I can't tell you what the next word I'm going to say is. Happen to be is. Or actually happen to be happen. I can't tell you, you know, why I'm going to decide to eat certain kind of food tonight over another, right? But if we had completed enough physics and science, neurobiology, genetics, we could. But, you know, the fact of the matter is, part of the reason that it feels so unintuitive that we wouldn't have free will is that the complexity at play here is astronomical, quite literally. And it's a level of complexity that we, like the most powerful computers, all the computers combined in the world, couldn't be able to predict, couldn't be able to you know, forecast. So that's part of why it feels so much like we have free will. But your subconscious is working on what you're going to do and say next. That's exactly, I couldn't have said it better myself. Okay, what am I doing? Duh. Ian, did you read a paper on autism and how it can be connected to the PNS? No, I did not. Oh, yeah, but was it the PNS or was it...
I think there's a paper that came out that like implicated the microbiome, that they found another microbe that predicted for autism. No, I don't think I saw that. So this is referring to the peripheral nervous system. What's up, Dark Swan? Good to see you. So rather than the central nervous system, the spinal cord, and the brain. Why are we better at social skills than abstract thinking? I don't know why you would argue that. Abstract thinking is like a quintessentially human phenomenon. Our ability, your ability to, like, yeah, I guess I'm not quite sure why you would even say that. Why? But in like being able abstraction or being able to abstract thinking is very important to social interaction. So yeah, I'm not sure what difference you're making. I'm probably just being dense here, so sorry about that. How can we think like a scientist that will help in business and personal life? I'm probably not the best person to ask, because I think like a scientist, and I don't do business. I think some of the most useful skills that a scientist uses is not being overly, or trying to avoid being biased on any kind of thing you're considering, right? Being driven by where the evidence points, rather than your personal biases or expectations. Being able to devise a set of questions, hypotheses, and you're being able to devise an experimental design that adequately, comprehensively tries to disprove your hypothesis. In other words, coming up with a strategy that before you even do the experiments, will be able to either prove or disprove, sort of. I mean, this is not correct scientific language, but prove or disprove your hypothesis. So, in business, I could imagine, like, if I'm trying to evaluate my business decisions, am I going to buy these products and sell to this group of people? Am I going to set my price at this level? Am I going to sell on Amazon? Am I going to sell on Etsy? Like those types of things. If you are able to incorporate as many possible variables as you can that would determine whether or not one decision would be better than the other, I think that scientific training is good for that. So in other words, like meticulous thinking, meticulous scrutiny and meticulous evaluation. Thank you for the super heart, Dark Swan. I appreciate that. How do we regulate the brain? I guess I'm not 100% sure what you mean by that, but like there is this weird feature of human consciousness where it's sort of like you can short circuit your subconscious a little bit. Like if you develop the desire to be less depressed, right, to improve your mood, you can engage in behaviors because you desire to alter your mood. Your sort of conscious awareness is regulating your subconscious in this sort of an abstract way, and so the intention to meditate or to exercise or to go meet new people or whatever it is sort of like you're sort of regulating your subconscious in that way, because you're deciding to engage in behaviors that have this regulatory effect on your mood. So there's that. Oh yeah, thanks, man. Thanks, Abetz. All right. I guess the legend of Krang remains a legend. Oh, I don't know about that. My ability to discern social cues versus doing a math problem. Okay, that is different. Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, I mean, social interaction is definitely, well, everything in the brain is related, right? But like, computational ability is, actually, there was a paper that came out on the relationship. I can't believe I didn't bring this up earlier. There was a paper that came out on the relationship between variants in a specific gene called ROBO1 and predicting two things: predicting the volume of the right parietal cortex and predicting math test scores by second grade. So basically this group found that they had known that this gene, among other genes, is associated with regulating how big the right parietal cortex will be. So it's sort of like right up here. But what they didn't know is whether or not it might predict for academic performance or math performance, and it turned out that they were able to something like it was like up to a fifth of the variance in mathematical ability can be predicted by early differences in the volume of the right parietal cortex. That would not be my right parietal cortex, but which is regulated in part by ROBO1. It's kind of cool. Anyways, computation. So computational skills arise from different regions of the brain than social interaction. And so understanding symbolic meaning from characters and like deeply understanding that is just like a different kind of skill than social interaction. And so just like people evidently can be born with predispositions to being developing an addiction to opioids or whatever, there will be subtle, oftentimes anatomical nuances that distinguish all of us, and those may or may not, I would imagine they probably do, translate to some slight differences in predispositions to developing skills in these different properties. Is using the brain more than 50% dangerous? That is kind of a funny way to ask that. So basically, you're suggesting that like humans are restricted to a like limited amount of brain activity for some reason, right? And we don't know why, but if we could only surpass that number, we would be better at pretty much everything. We could potentially move things with our mind, right? That's a myth. So there is no limitation. There's no governor on how much of your brain is available to be activated. The only limitation is that at a certain point, you're just going to begin having a seizure. And so also, just increasing global brain activity will not improve your performance on pretty much anything. In fact, it'll reduce your performance. Let's say you're trying to become the best orator of your generation, right? And you just wish that you could just turn up the volume, crank up the volume on your brain, and that would give you the skills to be this wonderful orator. But the problem is actually, if you were to do that, if you were to just crank up the volume just across the board in your brain while you're trying to give a talk, you would be a complete disaster, a complete mess. You would probably fall on the ground. You would probably just be bombarded with all these memories that have totally unrelated to the topic at hand. You'd probably be saying words that you don't intend to say. In fact, you probably couldn't even speak because you might be convulsing. That relationship, it's not like some brain activity is pretty good. More brain activity must be better. It's that's not how it works. It's more the pattern of brain activity, how compatible the pattern of brain activity is at any one time with the goal or the activity. All right. All right. Well, I should probably call it a day. My name is Ian McLaughlin. I have a YouTube channel. It's called youtube.com/anthropoid. And over there, I talked about microdosing, meaning taking very minuscule doses of substances like LSD or psilocybin. There was a study that came out. That's what I talk about. I have a podcast called Wired to be Weird, where I talk about a lot of the topics that came up today. Things like psychosis, things like schizophrenia, dreams, pharmacology of drugs, cannabis included, dementia, these types of things. So the podcast is called Wired to be Weird, and it's on iTunes and Stitcher and stuff like that. Other than that, hopefully I'll see you again this time, same place next week, next Sunday. I will see you there. Oh, I should say, if you're interested in those like specific topics that I go into, like, I've talked about Elon Musk's Neuralink and stuff like that, and like it's a little bit more enriched because I have like some videos and some images that sort of help to explain things. If you're interested in that, I would appreciate a subscription. Tickle that subscription button, prod it with a stick. Otherwise, see you next week, same time, same place. See you there. Have a great week, everybody. Stay safe. Wear a mask. All right. Thanks for watching, everybody. I really appreciate it. I really had fun. I ended up reading a lot more about microdosing than I talked about earlier, just because I find that history so interesting. And, the characters that were involved in this era were just so wild. And just like how kind of like this sense of like nothing can stop us, like this limitless potential, I think that was at least around for some people in that era. I think it's very romantic, and I don't think we have the similar kind of perspective today, unfortunately, perhaps. Anyways, so yeah, if you enjoy, tickle that subscribe button, and let me know, if there's any topics, or if you think I could improve things in any way. Otherwise, I will see you next week. See you guys.